Hello, welcome back to my channel and to my Fighting Fantasy Gamebook retrospective. And today we've reached books 11 and 12, Talisman of Death and Space Assassin. Now, I'll freely admit to you, right, the reason why I'm reviewing these two books together is because back in the day when I was a teenager, I didn't greatly like these two books and I wasn't really looking forward to playing them again. And part of the reason I didn't like them was because I felt they marked a shift in the series. You see, up to this point, the first 10 books had the names Steve Jackson or Ian Livingstone attached to them, right? And I quite like the fact that it was just run by these two guys. I didn't realise that book 8, Scorpion Swamp, had been written by the other Steve Jackson, right? So I thought Talisman of Death was the first book to be written by someone else. It was actually written by two writers called Jamie Thompson and Mark Smith. And immediately I detected a change in tone. First of all, there's that cover, which is done by Peter Andrew Jones. Peter Andrew Jones, of course, had done the original cover of Warlock of Firetop Mountain. But this cover, it seemed to me, was less grittily realistic than those of, say, Ian McCaig. It seemed more fantastical. It's a very striking, beautiful cover, but it seemed more fantastical. And then you get the introduction, don't you? The introduction to this book is a real massive slap in the face change of tone from the rest of the series. It's much more fantastical. It starts off and you're an ordinary person from the world of Earth and you're taken to a mystical land. So you're not an adventurer who's already in a Lancia, right? It's a different kind of game book. It reminded me a lot of, I don't know if you ever read the Stephen Donaldson books in the 70s and 80s. Do you remember that? The Covenant books, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, where he's this guy in real life who's got leprosy. They're very strange, gloomy books, quite squeamish. And he gets taken into this kind of Tolkien-esque landscape and he's a hero who has to change the way the world is going in this landscape. It reminds me a lot of that. It also reminds me a bit of Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion books. I don't even remember that, but as someone who keeps going through different time zones and worlds, always being this kind of champion, this kind of hero. And the fantastical tone of it reminded me of two other things, right? So you end up in this kind of castle in the sky with this kind of golden songbird that speaks to you. You know, it's almost like Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, you know. Then you go downstairs and there's these two gods that you're talking to. This woman who has a face like a mirror in which you see projected your destiny. And this other guy is a bit like Proteus. You remember that Lord of the Sea in Greek myths who keeps changing shape and he keeps changing from being an old man to a young man. It's really fantastical and weird. Much more like a sort of 80s fantasy movie like The Never-Ending Story. Or even more so, I don't know if you've ever come across this real cult novel from the 1920s called A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay. It's very strange. It's like a kind of weird sci-fi update of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, where these three people are in this observatory in Scotland and then they're projected onto this alien planet and they have these weird adventures that are kind of they're kind of allegories of, you know, I don't know, like a sort of spiritual progress through life. Very odd. They keep getting reborn as different creatures and stuff. And so, it's like, wow, this is a real change for this range. Suddenly we've gone from gritty Dungeons and Dragons adventures to this kind of wild fantasy. And then you're sort of transported down to this planet called Orb. And you find yourself in this rift, this terrifying chasm underground. And you meet these four very interesting kind of champions who give you your quest. And you think, this is going to be amazing, right? Then you get transported to the surface and suddenly it's really bland. It's really ordinary. The creatures you meet are standard practice from any old game book. Not much happens. There's not much gameplay. It's much more novelistic. You know, you get very few choices to make. Your path is very set out. There's nothing particularly fantastical about Orb. You potter through it. You meet some warrior women. You go into a city. You meet a few sort of denizens. What the story is that you're fighting death itself, right? He's got followers and worshippers on this planet who are going to try and revive him. An incredible concept. Yet you only meet a couple of them. You don't really feel their rising climactic presence throughout the story. And eventually you go up a mountain, you have a bit of a parley with a dragon, he tries to trick you, then you go through a portal and you're back home. Is that it? You know, really this book, it needed something much wilder, much more baroque. You know, you needed to sort of, the sort of encounters with the denizens of death needed to mount up as you go through the book. But in fact, the whole thing feels rather bland. Reading through it again this time round, I was struck all over again by how boring it is. I kept having to put it down and go and do the washing up or something. You know, I was struck, for example, in, here it is, my friends. I got it. You Are the Hero. Jonathan Green's new revised and updated history of fighting fantasy. It's a very beautiful book. Get hold of it. But I was struck how it's described in this book as a masterpiece. I can't get it. By the way, just while we're here, this has also come out. Beautiful book. All the artwork, the stunning artwork of the Fighting Fantasy series in beautiful full-page colour prints. Do get hold of it, it's fantastic. And also Ian Livingstone's new book is coming out soon as well. But in that book, Talisman of Death is described as a masterpiece, one of the classics of the range. And I know other people who follow Fighting Fantasy who say it as such, and it just doesn't do it for me at all. It's not helped by the interior illustrations, which are by Bob Harvey, which are just, they're not bad, but they're very ordinary. You know, this needed some sort of Cocteau wildness, a bit more like John Blanche's kind of work for the Sorcery series. It needed something strange and mysterious, otherworldly. But Bob Harvey's illustrations are very sort of bland and straightforward. You know, there's some interesting characters that he creates, but the creatures just look fairly, you know, standard issue. There's nothing particularly, I don't know, inspirational or odd or eccentric. And that's what this book really needed. I just think the whole thing, it just doesn't do it for me at all. I really wanted to like it this time round, but I really couldn't get into it. I'm sorry. It's a bit of a negative review from me for that one. I was even more dreading Space Assassin. When this first came out, I had a real downer on the science fiction ones. I didn't want the science fiction ones. And I don't think I even bothered playing this all the way through once, actually. I found it really boring. And I thought it was the weakest in the sequence up until that point. Playing it again this time round, perhaps I was a bit harsh on it, you know. I remember, those of you who've seen my review of Starship Traveller will know that I revised my opinion about Starship Traveller a bit. I revised my opinion about this one a bit. It's got some good ideas. It has one humdinger of an idea. So what happens is that you're an assassin who's going to kill this evil scientist on board this spaceship who's going to make the whole universe his slave. It feels like, you know, the writer just made that up, you know, 5 minutes before he started writing it. But anyway, so that's the plot. And you're going through this ship trying to find him and kill him. And at some point, through various ingenious methods, you suddenly find yourself on another planet. And it's as though the other planet is inside the spaceship. I thought that was a brilliant and ingenious concept, a wonderful shift of pace. But unfortunately, the writer, Andrew Chapman, doesn't do anything with it. And it just becomes a kind of Warlock of Firetop Mountains type maze. It's really boring. You know, this brilliant surreal shift in location doesn't really go anywhere, which is a real disappointment. And the whole book feels like that, right? I mean, it's like it comes up with some interesting interludes and characters, but they don't really add up to anything. Instead, Chapman sort of relies on old-fashioned kind of, you know, those kind of puzzles you used to get in annuals, like Doctor Who annuals in the 70s. You get that kind of thing. You know, you get that old chestnut where there's two doors and there's two guardians, and one of the guardians lies and one of the guardians tells the truth. Which door do you go through? That kind of thing. You know, and there's also like, which button do you press first? Then do you press this button and which sequence? Like little puzzles, you know. At one point, he even rips off the self-destruct sequence from Alien, which is quite amusing, actually. But you see what I mean? It doesn't build into anything really substantial. And then you meet Cyrus, and he basically just runs away from you, and you kill him quite easily. And then the book says, you've done it, the end. You know, I don't know if I've got this wrong, but at no point do you really have any sort of backstory on what this planet inside the spaceship is. It's just sort of left there. You presume that that's how he conquers worlds from his spaceship, that somehow he's able to access them by some kind of hyperspace within his own spaceship, which is an ingenious idea. But the writer doesn't do anything with it. It's so frustrating. And at the end of the day, it's a book that's quite forgettable, I think. I mean, epitomising that is the front cover. Now, that's by Chris Achilleos, who's one of the best fantasy artists of his generation. His Doctor Who book covers are amazing. This cover is fine, but it's so boring. You think of all the things you could have picked to represent two guys watching at a vid screen. Why? I mean, it's just such a boring image. The interior illustrations are done by Geoffrey Senior. These illustrations are amusingly schizophrenic. So the science fiction illustrations of the spaceship and its interior are quite dry and quite dull. So one of the things I didn't like about the science fiction books, some of them ape Alien again. But then when you get down to the planet and there's the creatures, Senior kind of wakes up and they're kind of weirdly hysterical and bonkers and quite fun. So the artwork is rather schizophrenic in this book. Unfortunately, it doesn't help the general tone of it. I find this book quite dull and probably my weakest entry in the first 12 books so far. So I'm sorry, a rather negative review of those two books. I tried very hard to like them this time around. Honestly, I did. I just didn't quite get there. But don't worry, because next time it's Freeway Fighter.